Next on stage, we've got Mohan Sridhar, who is a Carnatic singer and a teacher here in Townsville. And I'd like to invite Mohan on stage to give a workshop on Carnatic singing. Thank you.
That's it? Hello? Yeah. Can I take my oh, one second. Yeah.
Please welcome Mohan Sridhar.
Thanks, Chakri. Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers of the India Fest, Adani India Fest, for giving me the opportunity to share my knowledge on Indian classical music. What I plan to do in this workshop is to give you a sort of comparison between Indian classical music forms and Western classical music, just so you can get some get an idea of what are the differences, what are the similarities, and why the music sounds as it sounds. So, yep, next slide, please. So when we look at Indian classical music, there are two distinct but related forms of Indian classical music. One is in the north of India. It's called Hindustani music, and the southern variant of the Indian classical music form is called Carnatic. So when you might have heard Indian classical music forms before. They're very fluid in structure. They flow very easily. The key point that differentiates Indian classical music forms to Western classical music forms is the improvisation and the creativity that's afforded to the performers. There is obviously compositions are noted down and passed down from generation to generation, but when a particular composition is performed, it's not performed strictly to the way it's written down. There's a teacher-student way in which it's passed down, the compositions, and there are variations and connotations that are put in, depending on the creativity of the performer. So Indian classical music basically consists of seven notes. In Western classical, you'd know them as do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Similarly, in Indian classical, there is sa, ri, ga, ma, pa, da, ni. And there are variants between these notes, so different frequencies at which these notes are sung. And we have permutations and combinations that give us 72 parent ragas. They're called ragas, which are particular scales of music that are sung or performed. I'll give you an example. As a raga that we have in Carnatic music that's very similar to the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti scale is called Shankarabharanam. Sa, ri, ga, ma, pa, da, ni, sa, ni, da, pa, ma, ga, ri, sa, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. You can see similarities in the tone, in the notes that are sung there. An added component of Indian classical music is that from these parent scales consisting of 7 notes, you can have child ragas or what are called janya ragas, where some notes are omitted on the way up and omitted on the way down. So if I give you an example, the one I just sung for you now is Shankarabharanam, consisting of 7 notes up and down. A child ragam of that, where some notes are missing in the scale, is Mohanam. Sa, ri, ga, pa, da, sa, da, pa, ga, ri, sa. You can see that few notes are missing on the way up and down, but that gives a certain flavor of that particular ragam. Next, please. So when we look at Western classical music, you would have heard orchestras perform before. There are multiple melodies that are played at once. You'd have a woodwind section playing a particular melody, you'd have a brass section playing a particular melody, and even within these particular sections of the orchestra, you'd have the bass instruments playing a particular melody, and the other ones, and other instruments playing a treble clef, for instance. Harmony is a key component of Western classical music. When I mean harmony, I mean multiple melodies being played at once. And that's not a key component of Indian classical music, where there's only one melody going on at once. And all the performers, if there are multiple, will be performing that single melody. I'll give you an example. I'll have a couple of clips that I'll play later on that you can show you the difference between the two. Next slide, please. So just to summarize the differences, Western classical is based on harmony, where there are multiple melodies being performed, whereas the Indian classical form, there's only a single scale or melody that's being performed at once. There's a lot of scope for creativity and improvisation in Indian classical music, whereas Western classical music, if you've got a Beethoven symphony, every time a Beethoven symphony is going to be performed by a particular orchestra, it is going to sound the same. There is no real scope, for creativity within those compositions. Both Western and Indian classical have a 7-note scale, but there are multiple, notes within Indian classical music, different frequencies that give, 72 parent ragams that we can sing. Western classical music also has a beat. There's 4 beats per cycle for a composition. Indian classical music has, different varying beats. You can have a 6-beat cycle for a composition. You can have 8 beats, 9 beats, and there's a lot of, depending on the composition, it's set to different beat cycles. So I'll play the Western clip. I'm not sure if it's coming through. Give that another try. Not playing? Oh, that's unfortunate. That would have really highlighted no, that's not playing? Okay. That's not a problem. I just had an example of an orchestra playing where multiple, you got instruments playing different melodies within that composition, and then Indian classical music, which would be a violin playing a particular scale of the ragam, so you can understand, the different flavors that you're getting. Okay, next slide, please. So, if we look at a structure of a concert in an Indian classical format, you have different types of compositions. Usually we start with a varnam, which is a shorter, not as complex composition, which has got little scope for improvisation, just as to get you warmed up, really, to get into the larger pieces of the concert. Kritis are the main pieces. They're elaborate pieces with a lot of scope for improvisation, and how one person performs it in one concert is very different to another person performing, or even that person performing another concert somewhere else would perform that song differently each time. Tilanas come towards the end of a concert, which are fast, lively pieces, and then a mangalam is the final song, seeking the blessings of, the gods for, having a successful concert. Usually concerts go, between 2 and 3 hours, and if it's a vocal concert, you usually have accompanying artists playing a violin and a double-sided Indian drum, called a mridangam. So we go to the next slide. Similarly, in Western classical music, you have different compositions that are there. A sonata is made up of different passages, 3 or 4 different passages during the particular composition. a symphony, which would be familiar for orchestras, composed by Mozart and Beethoven, etc. And a concerto, which is you have an orchestra, but there's a solo element to the concerto. Next slide, please. So these are typical instruments used in Hindustani and Carnatic. There's instruments on the right side there. You have a harmonium, a tabla, which is a percussion instrument, and a sitar, which is the instruments used in Hindustani classical, the North Indian classical music. On the right-hand side, we have, in the middle, there's a tambura, which is an instrument that's used to keep a particular a drone in the background. We have a constant note or notes being played in the background, which provides the the octaves that the performer can sing in or play in. And then you have the veena, which is a stringed instrument in the south, similar to the sitar, but for South Indian classical music, and a violin, which is a Western instrument which has been adopted into Indian classical music as an accompanying and a solo instrument. So I hope this gives you some idea of the differences and similarities between the Indian classical and Western classical music, and I'd be happy to chat to anyone that'd like to come down into the tents at the side here and have a chat and a discussion about it. So thanks a lot to India Fest again, and I'll speak to you again later in the day. Thank you.